Stand anywhere on Earth today and look at the ground beneath your feet. Somewhere below you, buried under rock and time, there is a line. It is thin. In some places, it is no thicker than a sheet of paper. Above that line, the fossil record is full of life. Below it, life is also full and strange and crowded. But at the line itself, almost everything stops. Geologists have a name for that line. They call it the greatest catastrophe in the history of life on this planet. And the age of dinosaurs, the whole 165 million years of it, every giant and every hunter and every animal you learned to name as a child, begins on the far side of it. It begins in a graveyard. 250 million years ago, this was not a world that had any room for something new. It was a world that was still dying. The continents had drifted together into a single mass. One ocean, one land, from pole to pole. We call it Pangea. Standing at its center, you could walk for months in any direction and never reach the sea. The interior was a desert the size of a hemisphere, baked and shadeless, where the only water fell in violent seasonal storms and then vanished. And the animals that lived there were not dinosaurs. They were not anything you would recognize. The land belonged to creatures that were closer to the ancestors of mammals than to anything alive today. Squat, heavy-bodied, some the size of cattle. There were predators with saber teeth and sprawled limbs. There were amphibians as long as canoes, waiting in the river channels. It was a functioning world. It had been running for tens of millions of years. And then, in what geologists measure as an instant, it ended. In what is now Siberia, the crust opened. Not a volcano, not a chain of volcanoes. A wound in the planet that poured out lava across an area larger than Western Europe and kept pouring on and off for hundreds of thousands of years. The lava itself was not the killer. The killer was what the lava passed through on its way up. It burned through coal beds. It burned through salt deposits. It cooked the buried carbon of an entire continent and sent it into the sky as carbon dioxide, as methane, as sulfur, as chlorine. The atmosphere changed chemistry. The oceans warmed and then acidified, and then, in vast regions, ran out of oxygen entirely. Tropical sea surface temperatures may have climbed past anything a modern coral reef could survive. When it was over, somewhere between 8 and 9 out of every 10 species in the ocean were gone. On land, roughly 7 out of every 10 families of backbone animals had disappeared. This is the only mass extinction we know of that also took down the insects. Recovery was not quick. In most mass extinctions, the fossil record shows life bouncing back within a few 100,000 years. After this one, the rocks stay impoverished for something closer to 5 million. There is a way to picture that gap which makes it land properly. 5 million years is roughly the entire time that has passed since the first upright walking apes appeared in Africa. Take that whole span, every hominin species, every stone tool, every cave painting and every city, and that is how long the planet spent simply getting back to a functioning ecosystem. The survivors were not the impressive animals. They were the ones that had been unremarkable beforehand. Small burrowers, generalists, things that could eat whatever was left. This is a pattern that will repeat at the other end of this story, and it is worth marking now, because it is the closest thing the history of life has to a rule. Catastrophes do not select for excellence. They select for tolerance. For a long stretch afterwards, the fossil record goes quiet in a way that unsettles the people who read it. Coal stops forming because there are not enough forests left to make it. Reefs stop forming. In some rock sequences you find layer after layer with almost nothing in them but the burrows of small survivors, and again, the bones of a single animal. Its name was Lystrosaurus. It was about the size of a pig, with a beak and 2 tusks and no particular gifts. In some fossil beds from the early Triassic, it accounts for the overwhelming majority of every land vertebrate found. That is what recovery looked like. Not abundance. One animal, everywhere, in an empty world. But an empty world is also an opportunity. Every role that had been filled for 100 million years was suddenly open. Every way of making a living, from the treetops to the riverbanks, was available to whatever moved into it first. And something was moving. Not the biggest animal on the landscape. Not the strongest, and not, for a very long time, the most successful. Something small, standing on 2 legs, with hollow bones, and a strange way of holding its hips. It would take that animal 30 million years to become important. It would take a second global catastrophe to make it dominant. And when it finally inherited the Earth, it would hold it for longer than any other group of large land animals has ever managed. To understand how that happened, you have to start with a family argument. About 250 million years ago, in the ruins of the Great Dying, a group of reptiles began to spread. They were called archosaurs, which means ruling reptiles, and the name is a piece of hindsight. At the time, they were simply one more group scrambling through the wreckage. What made them different was mostly in the ankle and the skull. They had an extra opening in front of the eye socket. They had teeth set into sockets rather than fused to the jaw. Small things. Structural things. Fairly early on, this group split into 2 branches, and that split is the single most consequential fork in this entire story. One branch would eventually lead to crocodiles and alligators. The other branch would lead to pterosaurs and to dinosaurs, and through the dinosaurs eventually to birds. For the next 30 million years, the wrong branch was winning. The oldest animals that we can confidently call dinosaurs come from rocks in what is now northwestern Argentina, laid down around 230 million years ago. The formation is a valley of banded stone that looks like it belongs on another planet, and it has produced some of the most important fossils ever collected. Among them is a slender animal a little over a meter long, standing on its hind legs, with a light skull and grasping hands. Another is larger, perhaps 4 or 5 meters, clearly a hunter. A third is smaller still, the size of a fox. Look at these animals honestly, and there is nothing about them that announces 165 million years of dominance. They are quick. They are light. They are not rare, but they are not common either. In the ecosystems where they lived, they make up something like 5% of the animals found. The landscape around them belonged to somebody else. The other branch of the archosaur family, the branch heading toward crocodiles, had spent the Triassic building an empire. There were armored plant eaters covered in bony plates, some with spikes at the shoulder longer than a human arm. There were long-snouted river ambushers that looked so much like modern crocodiles that early paleontologists mistook them for relatives, when in fact the resemblance is one of the most striking cases of 2 lineages arriving at the same solution independently. And at the top there were predators that walked on upright legs, with deep skulls and blade-like teeth, reaching 5 or 6 meters. If you had visited the late Triassic and tried to guess which lineage would still be here in 100 million years, you would have looked at those animals, and you would have been wrong. It is worth walking through that world properly, because almost nobody pictures it. There were no birds. There were no flowers, no grasses, no broadleaf trees. The forests were conifers and seed ferns and cycads, and the ground cover was ferns and horsetails. There was no grazing as we understand it, because there was nothing to graze. Above the landscape, another branch of the bird line archosaurs had done something that no vertebrate had ever done before. The pterosaurs had taken a single finger on each hand, elongated it to the length of the rest of the arm, and stretched a membrane of skin and muscle fiber between that finger and the body. They were the first backboned animals to achieve powered flight, and they did it roughly 80 million years before the first bird. It is important to be clear about them, because they are constantly mistaken for dinosaurs, and they are not. They are close cousins on the same branch, and none of them survived to the present. And in the leaf litter, at the same time, in the same rocks, in the same ecosystems, something else was starting. The first mammals appear in the late Triassic. They were the size of shrews. They ate insects. They were almost certainly nocturnal, which is a thing you can read in their skulls, because their eye sockets are large and the parts of the brain given over to smell and hearing had already begun to expand. They will stay that way for 135 million years. The most important thing to understand about the age of dinosaurs is that our own ancestors were present for all of it, watching from underneath, unable to get any bigger. So what did the dinosaurs have? 3 things, none of which mattered yet. The first was in the hip. In most reptiles, the thigh bone sticks out to the side, and the animal walks with a sprawl, swinging its body from side to side with every step. In dinosaurs, the head of the thigh bone turns inward and slots into an open socket in the hip, so the leg hangs directly underneath the body. It is the posture of a horse or a dog or you. It is more efficient over distance, and it makes the animal capable of carrying far more weight. The second was in the lungs. Your lungs are dead ends. Air goes in, exchanges gas, and comes back out the way it came, which means that with every breath, fresh air mixes with stale air. It works, but it is a compromise. The bird-line archosaurs developed something else. A system of air sacs extending out of the lungs and into the body cavity and, eventually, into the bones themselves, pumping air through the lung in one direction, continuously on both the inhale and the exhale. No mixing. No dead end. We know that dinosaurs had this system, and we know it early, because the air sacs left their fingerprint in the skeleton. The bones are hollowed out and invaded by air pockets, and you can see the openings where the sacs pushed in. It is a lung that extracts more oxygen from every breath, and it will matter enormously later, for reasons no animal in the Triassic could have anticipated. The third thing was the least glamorous. They were small. They grew fast. They laid eggs in numbers. None of this was enough. For 30 million years, dinosaurs were a minor component of a world run by their cousins. They were not outcompeting anyone. They were waiting without knowing they were waiting. And then Pangaea began to tear itself apart. The supercontinent had been a single mass for a very long time, and single masses are unstable. Heat builds beneath them with nowhere to go. Around 201 million years ago, the crust split along a line running roughly where the Atlantic Ocean is now, from what would become Nova Scotia down through Morocco and into Brazil. Lava came up through the crack across an area of several million square kilometers. If this sounds familiar, it should. It is the same mechanism that ended the Permian in a different place at a different scale. The result was the same in kind. Carbon dioxide flooded the atmosphere. The oceans warmed and acidified. Something in the region of a third of marine genera vanished. And on land, the empire that the crocodile line had spent 30 million years building came apart. The armored plant eaters were gone. The great upright predators were gone. Of that entire vast branch of the family, what survived into the Jurassic were mostly semi-aquatic ambush hunters, the animals that would become the crocodiles we know, and they have kept to the water's edge more or less ever since. You can see the handover in the ground. In the sedimentary basins of eastern North America, the rock layers run continuously across the boundary, and preserved in them are footprints. Thousands of them. Below the boundary, the tracks are a mixture, with the crocodile line strongly represented and the largest prints belonging to them. Above it, within a geologically short interval, the mixture is gone and the large tracks are dinosaur tracks. Not only that, they get bigger. The average size of a meat-eating dinosaur footprint in those basins roughly doubles across the boundary, and it happens fast. That is what an ecological vacancy looks like when it is written into stone. Not a battle. A change in who is walking around. The dinosaurs walked through it. Not untouched. Some lineages died, but as a group, they crossed the boundary, and within a few million years on the other side, they had gone from roughly 1 in 20 of the animals in a given ecosystem to almost all of them. Why? This is the part where an honest documentary has to slow down, because the truthful answer is that we are not certain. There's a good argument that the lungs mattered. A world with more carbon dioxide and less available oxygen is a world where a more efficient respiratory system stops being a curiosity and starts being the difference between living and not. There is an argument that the upright posture and fast growth helped in unstable conditions. There is an argument about eggs and clutch sizes. And there is a possibility that has to sit alongside all of them, which is that they were lucky. That the extinction fell on the geography and the body sizes and the habitats where their rivals happened to live, and spared the ones where they happened to live, and that if you rare in the experiment, the crocodile line would win half the time. What we can say without hedging is this: the dinosaurs did not take the world by defeating anybody. They took it by still being there afterwards. That is a different kind of victory, and it is the one that most often decides the history of life. The world they inherited was breaking into pieces. Pangea was splitting, and every new sea and every new coastline meant new climates, new rainfall, new forests. The deserts of the Triassic interior gave way to something wetter and greener. For an animal group that had spent 30 million years small and quick and unremarkable, with a lung built for extracting every last molecule of oxygen from the air, and a hip built to carry weight, an enormous and previously locked door had just come open. They walked through it, and they began to grow. There is a limit to how large a land animal can be, and it has nothing to do with food. The largest land mammal that ever lived weighed somewhere between 15 and 20 tons, and it was a hornless rhinoceros relative with a neck like a giraffe. The largest land animal alive today is the African elephant, at 6 or 7 tons. In the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, dinosaurs repeatedly built animals at 50 tons. Some of the largest may have gone past 70. They did it not once but many times over, in separate lineages, on separate continents. Nothing else in the history of life on land has come close, and understanding why is the single best way to understand what a dinosaur actually was. Start with the neck. A sauropod, which is the group we are talking about, is essentially a machine for reaching food without moving. Some of them carried necks 9 meters long. A neck that long, made of solid bone and muscle, would be impossible. The animal could not lift it, and even if it could not afford the food to run it. So the neck was not solid. The vertebrae were hollowed out from the inside by extensions of the air sac system, the same system we met in the Triassic. In some sauropods, the bone in the neck vertebrae has been reduced to thin plates and struts around large air spaces. By volume, parts of the skeleton were mostly air. This is not a small effect. It is the difference between a neck that cannot exist and a neck that can. And it came directly from the breathing system that their small ancestors had already possessed for 80 million years before anyone needed it for this. Now go to the head, because the head is the surprise. For an animal weighing 50 tons, the skull of a sauropod is absurd. It is small enough that a person could carry it. There is almost no chewing apparatus. The teeth in some species are simple pegs, in others thin pencils, arranged at the front of the mouth like a rake. They did not chew. They stripped vegetation and swallowed it whole. Chewing requires jaw muscles, and jaw muscles require a heavy skull. And a heavy skull on the end of a 9-meter neck is a structural catastrophe. So the sauropods moved the entire digestive process backwards, into an enormous fermenting gut, where microbes did the work that teeth would otherwise have done. The animal became a vat with a hose on the front. The rake and the vat together explain the size. A sauropod could harvest an enormous volume of low-quality plant material very quickly, with almost no energy spent on processing it in the mouth, and then digest it slowly over days. And then there is the problem that people rarely think about. They laid eggs. The largest known dinosaur eggs are roughly the size of a football. A hatchling sauropod weighed a few kilograms, which means that an animal that would end its life at 50 tons began it at something you could hold in 2 hands. The growth required is almost difficult to accept. Bone histology, the study of growth rings inside fossil bone, tells us that these animals grew explosively, putting on weight at rates that no living reptile approaches and that stand comparison with large birds and mammals. Some estimates have the largest sauropods reaching adult size within a few decades. This is why a herd of sauropods would not have looked like a herd of elephants. There was no single body size. There were animals at every stage between a few kilograms and 50 tons, occupying, in effect, several different ecological roles over the course of one lifetime. Around them, in the great floodplain forests of the late Jurassic, the rest of the cast was assembling. There were plated dinosaurs with double rows of bony plates along the spine and a tail carrying 4 long spikes. And we now know those spikes were used because we have found predator bones with puncture wounds that match them. The plates themselves are still argued about. They are too thin and too poorly anchored to have been much use as armor, and they are riddled with channels for blood vessels, which has fed a long-running debate about whether they were used to shed or absorb heat, or for display, or simply to make the animal look larger from the side? The honest position is that we do not know, and that display is currently the favored answer. We know more about how these animals moved, and we know it from a source that surprises people. Not bones. Footprints. There are trackways preserved in the late Jurassic and Cretaceous where dozens of sauropods walked in the same direction, at the same time, with the smaller individuals in the middle. That is a herd with a structure. There are trackways where a predator's prints follow a sauropod's prints, matching stride for stride, and then the spacing changes. There are trackways along ancient shorelines that go on for hundreds of meters. Footprints record behavior in a way that a skeleton never can. A skeleton tells you what an animal was. A trackway tells you what it was doing on a particular afternoon. There is one more thing about the giants that is difficult to arrange in your head. An animal of 50 tons has a serious problem getting rid of heat. Volume rises faster than surface area, so the bigger you get, the harder it is to cool down. And a large sauropod in a warm Jurassic climate should in principle have cooked itself from the inside. The air sac system appears to be part of the answer here as well. Air moving continuously through a network of sacs distributed through the body cavity and the bones is, among other things, an internal radiator. The same piece of anatomy that made the neck possible may also be what made the body survivable. There were the hunters. A 5-ton predator with a light, hollow, oddly weak-looking skull that seems to have been used less as a crushing tool than as a blade, driven down with the muscles of the neck. And there were the small ones. In the shadows of the giants, in the leaf litter and the low branches, a group of small, fast, sharp-clawed theropods was quietly acquiring the strangest set of features in the entire history of vertebrates. Because at some point in the Jurassic, dinosaurs grew feathers. In 1861, in a limestone quarry in southern Germany, workers split a slab and found an impression that changed the argument about life on Earth. The limestone there is extraordinarily fine-grained, laid down in still, oxygen-poor lagoons where a carcass could settle and be buried without being disturbed. It preserves detail that almost no other rock preserves. What lay on the slab was an animal about the size of a raven, with a long bony tail, teeth in its jaws, and claws on its fingers. All of which said reptile. And spread around it, unmistakably, in perfect detail, were feathers. It arrived 2 years after Darwin published, and it became the single most argued over fossil of the 19th century. Here was an animal that was clearly both things at once. But for more than a century afterwards, it sat almost alone. It was a bridge with nothing on the far bank. The reconstruction of dinosaurs that most people grew up with, the scaled, cold, lizard-like monster, stayed intact, and the feathered animal in the German limestone was treated as a curiosity at the edge of the family. Then, in the 1990s, farmers in northeastern China began pulling fossils out of a series of lake bed deposits, and the picture came apart. The deposits are around 125 million years old, buried repeatedly under fine volcanic ash, and like the German limestone, they preserve soft tissue. But unlike the German limestone, they preserve it by the hundred. The first one to be published widely was a small predator about a meter long with a long tail. It was clearly a dinosaur, not a bird. It could not fly, and there was nothing about it that suggested it ever had. And running down its neck and back and along the entire length of its tail was a dense covering of fine, hollow filaments. Then came another, and another, Over the following 2 decades, the count ran into dozens of species. Some had simple filaments. Some had branched structures. Some had fully formed, veined feathers of the kind you would find on a bird's wing, arranged on animals that had no possibility of getting off the ground. The conclusion was unavoidable, and it reversed the order of the story. Feathers did not evolve for flight. Flight was a later use of something that already existed. What they evolved for, most likely, was heat. A small, fast-growing, warm-bodied animal loses heat quickly, and a coat of fine filaments is one of the best insulators in nature. After that came display and brooding, because we have found dinosaurs fossilized, sitting on top of their own nests in the posture of a nesting bird. And we have found the arms held in a position that only makes sense if they were covering eggs with feathered surfaces. That fossil is worth describing because it settles an old accusation. It was found in the Gobi Desert, and when the first specimens of its kind were dug up in the 1920s, sitting on top of a clutch of eggs, the animal was assumed to be a thief caught raiding somebody else's nest. It was named accordingly, with a name that means egg robber, and the name has stuck ever since. 70 years later, someone cracked open one of the eggs from that same type of nest, and inside was an embryo of the supposed thief. It was not stealing the eggs. It was sitting on them. Its arms were folded back and outward over the clutch in the exact posture a brooding bird uses, and the only reason to hold your arms that way is if there is something on them broad enough to cover the eggs. The same desert produced the single most extraordinary fossil in this entire story, which is a small predator and a horned plant-eater locked together, the predator's claw at the throat of the other animal, the plant-eater's beak clamped down on the predator's arm, both of them buried mid-fight by what was probably a collapsing sand dune. Feathers themselves did not appear all at once. The fossils from China preserve a sequence. First simple hollow filaments like a single hair. Then tufts of filaments joined at the base. Then a central shaft with filaments branching from it. Then barbs with hooks that lock together into a flat, continuous, aerodynamic surface. Every stage of that sequence is useful on its own for insulation or display. None of the early stages is useful for flight. This is a textbook case of a structure being built for one purpose over tens of millions of years, and then being available, fully formed when a different opportunity appeared. And then the technology caught up in a way nobody expected. Inside feathers there are microscopic structures called melanosomes, which carry pigment. Their shape correlates with color. Sausage-shaped ones tend to mean black and gray. Spherical ones tend to mean reddish-brown. They fossilise, which means that for a handful of these animals, we now have a defensible statement about what color they were. One small predator appears to have been a reddish chestnut over the back, with a tail banded in alternating stripes like a lemur. Another, a four-winged animal with feathers on both its arms and its legs, appears to have been mostly gray and black, with white on the limb feathers and a crest of reddish-brown feathers on the head. These are animals from 125 million years ago, and we can describe their coloring. There is one more consequence, and it lands closer to home. The famous pack-hunting raptor from the films, the one the size of a person, was in life about 2 meters long from nose to tail tip and weighed roughly as much as a large dog. And on the bones of its forearm, paleontologists have found a row of small bumps. In modern birds, those bumps are quill knobs. They are the attachment points for the large feathers of the wing. The animal had wing feathers. It could not fly. It carried them anyway, because it had inherited them from an ancestor that had them for something else entirely. While all of this was happening, in the shadows and the undergrowth, the world above was changing color. For the first 100 million years of the age of dinosaurs, the land was green, and it was almost nothing else. Conifers, ferns, cycads, horsetails, ginkgos. A landscape of needles and fronds, reproducing by spore and by cone, unchanged in its basic architecture since long before the first dinosaur. And then, somewhere around 130 million years ago, the fossil record begins to fill with something new. Flowers. It is difficult to overstate what flowering plants did to the world, and easy to miss, because they are so ordinary to us now. Almost every plant you have ever eaten is one. Grass is one. Oak trees are one. What makes them different is speed. A conifer takes a long time to grow and a long time to reproduce. A flowering plant can germinate, mature, flower, set seed and die inside a single season. It can colonize disturbed ground faster than anything that came before it. And by packaging its pollen in a structure designed to attract an animal, it outsourced its own reproduction to insects, which meant it could reproduce without wind and without waiting. Through the Cretaceous, these plants spread across the world and rebuilt the base of the food chain underneath the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs responded by rebuilding their mouths. The duck-billed dinosaurs, which became some of the most abundant large animals on Earth, evolved something that no reptile had ever had and that no reptile has had since. Behind the beak, packed into the jaw, were hundreds of teeth, stacked in columns several deep, cemented together into a single continuous grinding surface. As the top of each column wore away, the tooth beneath it moved up to replace it. It is a self-replacing millstone, and it let these animals process tough, abrasive, low-quality plant material at a scale nothing else could match. Some individuals carried more than 1,000 teeth in the head at once. Their relatives, the horned dinosaurs, went the other way, with a heavy beak and shearing teeth for slicing rather than grinding, and a bony frill at the back of the skull that in the largest species was more than 1/3 of the animal's total length. And some of them built instruments. Several duck-billed species carried hollow crests on top of the skull, and those crests are not solid ornaments. The nasal passages run up into them, loop around, and come back down. Researchers have made physical models and digital reconstructions of those passages and blown air through them. They resonate. Different species produce different frequencies, largely in the low range, the kind of sound that carries a long way through forest. A herd of these animals was not a silent herd. The Cretaceous is also the point at which we have to correct another habit of speech. The great swimming reptiles of this period, the long-necked ones and the ones shaped like sharks, and the enormous marine lizards of the final few million years, were not dinosaurs. Neither were the pterosaurs overhead, which by now included species with wingspans of 10 or 11 meters, as large as a small aircraft. All of these were separate reptile lineages that happened to share the world. Dinosaurs, as a group, never fully returned to the sea. They did, however, go to the poles. In southern Australia, in rocks laid down when that landmass sat inside the Antarctic Circle, and in northern Alaska, paleontologists have found dinosaur bones in quantity. The Cretaceous was warm, so this was not ice, but it was still a place with months of continuous winter darkness. There are juvenile bones there, which suggests they were not simply passing through. Some of these populations appear to have lived there year-round, through the dark. An animal that can hold body temperature through a polar winter is not the sluggish, sun-dependent creature that the word reptile brings to mind. Meanwhile, the continents kept separating, and separation does something specific to life. It isolates populations. Isolated populations diverge. The Cretaceous is the point where dinosaur faunas on different landmasses start to look genuinely unlike each other, and the total diversity of the group climbs to its highest point. And in the last few million years of it, in Western North America, one animal takes the top of the food chain and holds it. There is no point pretending it is not the one everybody wants to hear about. It was around 12 meters long. Weight estimates vary with method, but most modern reconstructions put a large adult somewhere between 6 and 9 tons. Its skull was 1.5 meters long and, unlike the light-bladed skulls of earlier great predators, it was built as a crushing device, reinforced and thick, with teeth that were not blades but heavy pegs, some as long as a human hand, rooted deeply enough to take enormous load. The bite force estimates are the highest ever calculated for a land animal. This is an animal that did not slice flesh from bone. It broke the bone and ate it, which we know because we have found its droppings, and they are full of pulverized bone fragments. Its eyes faced forward, giving it overlapping fields of vision and true depth perception, which is unusual in a large predator and suggests something about how it hunted. The parts of its brain devoted to smell were enormous, and it grew the way sauropods grew. Bone histology shows a slow start, then a period in the teenage years of explosive growth, adding something in the region of 1.5 tons per year, then a leveling off. There was no such thing as a medium-sized adult. There were juveniles, which were long-legged and relatively lightly built and probably hunted quite differently, and there were adults. Here's the fact about this animal that is hardest to hold in your head. It is late. Extraordinarily late. The plated dinosaur with the spiked tail lived around 150 million years ago. This animal lived around 66 million years ago. The gap between them is more than 80 million years. The gap between this animal and you is 66. It lived closer in time to us than to the animals that most people picture standing beside it. The age of dinosaurs is not a single scene. It is a period so long that its own inhabitants were separated from each other by more time than separates us from its end. And its end was already scheduled. Somewhere out beyond the orbit of Mars, on a trajectory that had been fixed for millions of years, an object was falling toward the inner solar system. It was somewhere between 10 and 15 kilometers across. That number is easy to say and almost impossible to picture, so try it this way. If you set it down on the ground, the top of it would be roughly at the cruising altitude of a passenger aircraft and above the height of Everest. It was traveling at something like 20 kilometers per second. At that speed, the atmosphere is not really an atmosphere. The object crossed the entire depth of the sky, from the edge of space to the surface, in less than 2 seconds. It did not slow down in any meaningful way. For anything close enough to see it, there was no streak of light in the sky and no warning. It was not there, and then it was. It struck the shallow sea covering what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The energy released was on the order of billions of times the energy of the bombs dropped in the Second World War. The crater it left is around 180 kilometers wide, and it is still there, buried under sediment, detectable as a ring of gravitational anomalies and a semicircle of sinkholes at the surface. Within seconds, a column of vaporized rock, both the asteroid and the seafloor, was punched out of the atmosphere entirely. Some of it left the planet. Most of it did not, and what came back is the part that mattered. Molten rock, thrown up on ballistic trajectories, spread across the entire globe, and then fell back through the atmosphere as billions of tiny glass droplets, re-entering at high speed. Every one of them released heat on the way down. The result was that for a period of hours, the sky itself, everywhere in the world, radiated heat downward. Estimates of how hot vary and the details are argued over, but the broad picture is agreed. Any animal that could not get underground or underwater or into a deep cave or a burrow was in serious trouble no matter how far it was from Mexico. Then came the tsunami, which in the Gulf region has left deposits hundreds of kilometers inland. And then the part that actually did the killing. The rock at the impact site happened to be rich in sulfur-bearing minerals. Vaporized, that sulfur went into the upper atmosphere as aerosols, along with soot from continent-scale fires and fine dust. It stayed there. Sunlight at the surface dropped. Photosynthesis on land and in the surface ocean slowed or stopped. Temperatures fell sharply. The base of every food chain on Earth failed at the same time. That is the mechanism. Not the fireball, not the wave. A world that stopped growing food for long enough that everything above a certain body size and dependent on fresh plant or animal matter ran out. The size threshold is the part that decides who is reading this. Run the numbers on what an animal needs and a rough figure falls out. Above roughly 25 kilograms, in a world where nothing is growing, you cannot find enough to stay alive for the length of the crisis. Below it, you can, especially if your diet includes seeds, which are effectively packed lunches that plants leave behind and which survive in the soil for years. No land animal above that threshold appears to have made it through in any lineage anywhere on Earth. That single line is why the world you live in looks the way it does. Not because mammals were better, because for one specific window of time, being small stopped being a limitation and became the only thing that mattered. For a long time, this was a hypothesis built mainly on a thin layer of clay, found worldwide at exactly the right depth, enriched with iridium, an element rare in the Earth's crust and common in asteroids. Then the crater was identified. And more recently, at a site in North Dakota, paleontologists described a deposit that appears to record the impact day itself, more than 3,000 kilometers from the crater. Fish jammed together in a surge of sediment, with impact spherules lodged in their gills, as though they had breathed them in while they were still falling. There is a complication, and it deserves to be stated rather than smoothed over. The impact did not arrive into a healthy world. For hundreds of thousands of years before it, enormous volcanic eruptions had been underway in what is now India, on a scale comparable to the events that ended the Permian and the Triassic. Climate was already unstable. How much of the extinction belongs to the volcanism and how much to the asteroid is still genuinely debated among specialists. What is not seriously debated is that the impact happened, that it happened at the boundary, and that it was the trigger. When it was over, roughly 3/4 of all species on Earth were gone. Every dinosaur larger than a few kilograms. Every flying pterosaur. The great marine reptiles. The ammonites, which had been in the oceans for hundreds of millions of years. The survivors have something in common, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. They were small. Many of them burrowed or lived in water, which buffered the heat. Many of them could eat seeds or insects or dead material, which are the food sources that persist when nothing is growing. Small, sheltered, and not fussy. And among them, unremarkable, easy to miss, there was a group of feathered dinosaurs with beaks and no teeth. There is a habit of speech that this story has to correct at the end. We say that birds are descended from dinosaurs, in the way we might say that humans are descended from earlier apes. It sounds right, and it is wrong, or at least it is much weaker than the truth. Birds do not descend from dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs. They are a surviving branch of the theropods, the same group that contains the great predators and the small feathered hunters of the Chinese lake beds. In the way that biologists now classify life, a bird sits inside the dinosaur family in exactly the way a bat sits inside the mammals. Leaving the group is not something a lineage can do. And they carry the equipment. The wishbone in a roast chicken is a furcula, two collarbones fused into a single springy strut. It is present in the great Cretaceous predators. It is present in the small feathered theropods. It was a dinosaur bone long before it was a bird bone. The air sacs are still there, still pushing into the bones, still driving air through the lung in one direction. That is the system that first appears in small Triassic animals 250 million years ago, that let sauropods build necks that should not have been possible, and that today lets a bar-headed goose fly over the Himalayas at an altitude where a human would lose consciousness. The eggs, in hard-shelled clutches in a built nest. The brooding posture, arms folded over the eggs, exactly as preserved in fossils from the Gobi Desert. The scaled feet. The three main forward-facing toes that leave a print in mud that is very difficult to tell from a small dinosaur track, because it is one. There are around 11,000 species of birds alive today. There are fewer than half as many species of mammals. And they took the world back quickly. The recovery after the impact was faster than the recovery after the Permian. And within about 10 million years, the surviving bird lineages had radiated into most of the shapes we know now. Perching birds, water birds, birds of prey. Somewhere in there, some of them lost flight again and went back to being large ground predators, and for a period in South America, they were the top carnivores on the continent, standing over 2 meters tall with a beak like an axe head. Mammals did the same thing on the ground, and this is the moment our own ancestors finally get to grow. Within roughly the same 10 million years, the shrew-sized insect eaters that had spent 135 million years in the undergrowth produced hoofed animals, primates, and the first whales. Everything about the world you know is downstream of a single bad afternoon. By the simplest measure available, the count of surviving lineages, the age of dinosaurs is not over, and the dinosaurs are not the losers of this story. They are the most successful group of large land vertebrates that has ever existed. They held the planet for 165 million years. They took the worst single day in the history of complex life, and a branch of them walked out the other side and is currently outnumbering us. So go back to where this started. A thin line in the rock under your feet, marking a world that died. Above it, an animal that nobody would have bet on, small and quick and unremarkable, waiting 30 million years in the shadow of its cousins for a catastrophe that would clear the way. It is the same story at both ends. Not the strongest, not the biggest, the one that was still there afterwards. Which is worth remembering the next time you are outside, and something with hollow bones and a wishbone, and a one-way lung lands on the ground a few meters from you, looks at you sideways, and goes back to what it was doing. It has been here longer than you have.